Veil podcast. I'm Elle.
I'm Camille.
We're excited today to share with you Doug Yeaman. He has been a long time coming. I think in the couple of episodes prior, you may have heard us introduce him at the end of an episode. And to be fair and honest, this is our fourth time recording this. So we're excited to finally bring this to our audience today. We love Doug. He has an educational background in mathematics and a PhD in physics. And so his science is on point. He has since done extensive work in management and human resource development. He is considered an expert in applied general systems theory and has trained tens of thousands of professionals and CEOs in productivity development and worked with several notable educational facilities. He is the founder of the company Quantum Management Systems and the author of 3 books, including a current project that he's working on currently right now, the What Works Code. And today he's going to be introducing us to the realm of quantum physics and what science has to say about spiritual gifts.
And he's McKinley's dad.
And he's McKinley's dad. If y'all remember McKinley from several
That's the
weeks
important
past,
point.
There we go.
he's awesome, and he's awesome too. Doug actually has given us some visuals today.
Oh, yes.
The subject matter is a bit more complicated than we may usually touch upon, so he has done us the great favor of organizing a PowerPoint presentation for us to follow along.
I think the agenda of what you might get, what we want to talk about and what you'd like to hear and your audience like to hear is what is the background and then what is some of the science that reinforces or points to the validity of what we might call psychic phenomenon, what I like to think of as precognition and the other parts of that. You know, the interesting thing about this whole conversation is that the first place that people go when you have this conversation is that it's a fringe. It's a fringe science. If it isn't fringe, it's certainly not part of the core of physics. And the way that I always like to comment on it when I have those kinds of conversations is Copernicus was a classic example of somebody who was a fringe scientist. You know, they locked him up because he had a view that was different than what was contemporary. And so I don't think there's any meaning in it. You know, one of the things that I'm going to talk about somebody named Jessica Utz, who is I've interviewed. And by the way, I've talked to, just as a footnote, everyone that I'm going to quote here that is still alive, I have talked to, with the exception of John Wheeler. I've had personal, extensive interactions with them. Jessica Utz was the former president of the American Statistical Association. She was the 111th president. One of the things that she said about it that I like, she said that parapsychology, which is where she spent a fair amount, she was hired by the federal government to do research on it. She said, what parapsychology is it's a way of pointing to what we don't know and what we haven't explored in physics. And I kind of like that. I like thinking that. So let's jump in. In order for us to have any kind of a conversation, we have to have some structure a framework from which to have a meaningful conversation. So I'd like to start with thinking about the universe, what I call the conscious universe. And that'll become more clear later on as we get there. What does that mean? What does the conscious universe mean? But I created here a structure that basically describes what I think are the components of a conscious universe. One of my assertions is that the universe is purpose-driven. I'm going to make actual demonstration and documentation that indicates by real solid scientists that concept has some validity to it. Then we talk about the potential of everything that can be created. Then from that we have the information field. Then from that are created principles and rules. From that is what is consciousness, and lastly observation and intention. So that's the framework we're going to work with. It's also my evolutionary framework for the universe. So when we talk about a conscious universe and it being purpose-driven, and this is just absolutely essential and critical to me. Roger Penrose was one of the people that worked with Stephen Hawking in creating the math and the science of the black hole. He is an extraordinary scientist. He's one of the most brilliant people still alive on our planet today. And he said that probability, he looked at the probabilities. And we're going to use that term a lot today because you can't talk about reality without talking about probabilities, which is why Jessica Utz is so important. His calculations led him to the remarkable conclusion, and I'm quoting this: the creator's aim must have been accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That number is so large that we could never even write it. Penrose put it that the number, it's a number that's impossible to write in a decimal way, because even if we were able to put a 0 on every particle in the universe, there are not enough particles to do the job. Now, here's what he basically said. He said that the probability that the universe was just created as an accident, it makes absolutely no statistical sense. Fred Hoyle, who was the astronomer, the great astronomer, one of the greatest astronomers of our time, when he looked at the same thing, he said a super intellect is monkeyed with physics. So there is a consensus by really smart people that something is unique in the universe, and I call it being purpose-driven. In other words, there is a purpose to our universe in everything that happens. And I intend to show that or demonstrate that in a few minutes.
To sum up with that, you're saying that it was created intentionally, that there was something behind the reason, and there is a reason behind the universe's existence.
It wasn't accidental. Like, it's very, very, very impossibly unlikely that it was accidental.
Yes, that is the point of Roger Penrose. The universe came into being as an accident. It just makes no sense at all. He actually took the time. He's a mathematician who could take the time, and he took the time to try and figure out what is the probability that it just came into being. I like his math. I like his science. I like Roger Penrose a lot. I have very high regard for him. I have not met him. He's somebody that I very much would like to, but he's still on my list. Niels Bohr was one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. We're talking now about quantum potential because the universe is purpose-driven. I won't say it came into being with a purpose. It came into being driving a purpose. What Niels Bohr said is, and this is really remarkable, he was one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics was created at the same time as Einstein. Many people don't know this, but Einstein actually got the Nobel Prize, not for his work around theory of relativity, but for his work on photons, which was the birth of quantum mechanics. So Einstein was very much involved in quantum mechanics. He struggled with it a lot. He struggled accepting some of the implications of it. He didn't struggle with the core of quantum mechanics, except what it implied. Niels Bohr, who was his contemporary, he says, everything we call as real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. If quantum mechanics hasn't profoundly shocked you, you haven't understood it yet. In my first year of my introductory class to quantum mechanics, it was Quantum Mechanics 201. The professor, within the first 15 minutes, said 2 things that have stuck with me my entire life. He said, believe nothing and question everything. And that has become somewhat a foundational principle or a foundational operational point for me. Believe nothing, question everything. And the second thing that he said was, which has had really profound impact on me, which is if you have 2 people that are in opposition with each other, two experts that basically disagree, choose your expert. In other words, in science, there is no right expert. It is the nature and the process of disagreement that stimulates science. And I want to make sure that that's clear, because people who challenge this stuff disregard the freedom or the opportunity to disagree, to have constructive disagreement. When you hear someone just brushing it off out of hand, it is because they are not willing to recognize that there is no right opinion on it.
I think a lot of people think that, oh, well, science has proven this. It's like, well, my sister works in research, and you can prove a lot of things with the way you set up your data. Like, whoever you're working for, they want you to prove something. You know what I mean? Science isn't like black and white. There's different experts that disagree with each other. It's not like there's just only one finding. There's There's controversy
Yeah.
within science. It's not
You know,
completely
that
simple.
that point was profound for me. You got to remember that science disagreement is everything.
Right.
Healthy discourse.
Yeah, because
So
it pushes it further.
Yes.
yes, the next step in it is that what was created was potential. And potential is everything that can be possible. The way I like to think about it, let me go to the next slide because this helps. This is a diagram. This kind of diagram is from NASA, so I like it a lot. I don't know that it's how accurate it is, but it is. NASA has put a lot of time and effort and energy and money into it. But it shows the beginning of the universe, what it calls quantum fluctuations, and then it's called inflation. So at the beginning, what was at the very, very, very beginning of the universe? And I would suggest that it was the birth of potential. When we talk about potential and we talk about information, I'm going to give you a very bad example, analogy you can use to think about it, to understand it. Think about a thumb drive. It can handle everything that can happen in the universe, but think of it as a thumb drive. When it was first created, there's nothing on it. It has no information. However, in this thumb drive of the universe, there is one single thing that is created that is different than the thumb drive, and it is the program from which all of the rest of the information that can be created is going to be created from. So this thumb drive is the very, very birth and the beginning of the universe, and it was created with potential. But more than just potential, it was created with an instruction set that basically said and instructed it as to how it was to be, what was possible, how was information to be recorded, how was information to be created, how are particles to behave, and what does that whole process look like? So this diagram shows the history of that process. And what I like is, like at the very, very beginning, if you accept the diagram as approximately an accurate depiction of how we think about it, notice that the closer you get to the left side of this diagram, the closer you get to nothing, but it's also a step of light. So I like this diagram for that reason. Information on this thumb drive creates what is called the information, what I think of as the information field. There are scientists that work around it. People like John Wheeler have moved away from calling it a field and basically refer to it as just information. So the question is information the only thing that exists? Well, in physics, John Wheeler suggests that information is more fundamental than matter, and I think this is important. Now, think about it for a minute. What we have at the core of everything is information, and it's more fundamental than matter, and it's more fundamental than energy, and it's more fundamental than space-time. And the problem starts when we try to work out what that means, because it's incredibly complex and abstract. So John Wheeler, he just passed away here a few years ago. He was clearly somebody that I just have extraordinary respect for. And I quote him all the time because I so respect his work. On the right, this diagram, that was a caption that Wheeler created that as a symbol to describe what happens in a black hole. He said that even a black hole could be reduced down to numbers and the binary numbers. And he said that every physical entity, every it, is derived from bits. So in other words, everything comes out of bits of information. And the interesting thing was in Wheeler's model, it was ones and zeros, bits of information. The laws of quantum, now this is something that I think is really worth remembering. The laws of quantum physics or quantum mechanics dictate that information can never be destroyed, period. And everything that is physical is derived from information. So that takes us now to a concept, and I know, Elle, you and I talked about this right at the very, very first time we ever talked, which is this phenomenon of entanglement. One of the ways to think about it, and this is, I will tell you, every way you try and think about it is wrong. So just start. There is no right way to think about it because it doesn't fit in our reality, in our conscious reality, the way we think about it. And the concept is when two particles such as a pair of photons or electrons, become entangled, connected. They remain connected even when separated by vast distances. Everything physical is derived from information. Let's talk about for a minute what is information, because this is where it starts to become a little obscure. And one of the reasons I like this concept is because it helps to explain things like there's a phenomenon, a friend of mine, actually I've spent hours and hours and hours with him. His name is Rupert Sheldrake. Came up with it, has written a book called The Sense of Being Stared At. One of the things that he identified and has actually tracked and documented is that very, very many people will have the experience of sitting passively, not doing anything particularly, just engaging in whatever it is that they're doing. All of a sudden, somebody's face or name or relationship will pop into their mind, and almost instantaneously the phone will ring. What is the coincidence of that? Why are those two events coincident? And I think entanglement is one of the ways that explains that, is that our information, shared information, this thing called the information field, we share that information. And once we're entangled in that information, we are eligible to both receive it and to recognize it, participate with it, and engage in it.
It's like that
So can I,
saying when people say, "Oh, are your ears burning?" Or because we were just talking about you and you just called us. It's that phenomenon that I know a lot of people relate to this phenomenon.
I am thinking that a lot of our listeners might be very interested in the subject of the information field and expanding on that a little bit further into what that is. And I mean, it is something that is science is just beginning to touch upon in a lot of ways. So we don't have a great understanding of it and maybe can't describe it or what it is in adequate terms. But it's very fascinating, and I know a large bulk of the discussions we've had in the past have kind of centered around what the information field is, how it might work, how it might affect us, and I think that that would be very interesting for our listeners to hear a little bit more about. The information field is something that interacts with all of us, kind of like overlays. Calling it the field instead of information might make it a little more easily visualizable. If, per my understanding, it contains all of the potential and the recorded information that has existed and can exist, as you've explained it to us in the past. Is that accurate?
Let's talk about what information is first.
Okay.
So information, if two things happen together, and I'm going to use a macro example because it's hard to think of it as a micro example at the subatomic level. But think about it in this way. You and I met each other, and from that point on, from the moment that we first met, there was an event created. That event contained all of the information of that moment. So that what happens is that the events that are created from those interactions become the information field. And the information field stores everything that can happen, everything that has happened, and the rules that govern it.
Yeah, that's the interesting part for me, the potential, because people say like God knows kind of how we're going to choices we're going to make. Well, maybe he can
It's
see
omniscience.
all these potential
It's
depending on
omniscience.
yeah, his information, his access to the information field is completely like uninhibited. He can see all of the potential based on what we're doing now. Like he can see how things are going to go next. It's like he just can see it like it's all in the present, which to me is so fascinating.
Think of it like this. Back at the beginning, when there was, if you accept the notion that the universe was created in a birth, in a moment, and that diagram that I was using, what happened at the beginning was that first what happened was that energy was created, came out of it. And that energy then created particles. Okay, so it was that energy and that exchange of things happening with the energy that caused the particles to come into being and interact. So the minute particles began to interact, they created events. Those events, those particles created, required that they behave in a particular way that evolved, that led towards creating what I would characterize as creating the conditions for life. So that every single interaction and every single event set up the next event that would create the conditions for life to exist. And so entanglement occurs because you have an obligation. We become entangled and required from those events to create the next set of events that are consistent with the original purpose.
Right. So everything is connected because it all derives from the same thing, essentially.
And towards the same thing.
Towards the same thing. That is a hugely, like, the implications of just that statement are enormous in our everyday life, right? But
Yes.
from human perspective, from like universal perspective, all of these things, we're all connected to absolutely everything else. Matter is connected, and the purpose that we're going towards is connected.
Yeah, just like to
It's big.
bring it down to like something relatable. I mean, you talk about the information field system in a forest where the trees, the roots, they, if there's one tree that's deficient in some type of nutrient, they can share with each other and they can communicate that way. Like it's like a forest information field. And I remember reading a book about one of the children that was killed in the Sandy Hook shootings before she passed. Her name was Emily. She would share with her mom in her drawings, and she would talk about how everybody was connected. It's like she had this psychic, God-given understanding that she shared with her family a lot before she passed away. She would talk about how everything was connected. And her mom has this new meaning to that now that her daughter has passed away, and she's had experiences with her daughter on the other side of the veil where she's getting that message over and over. We're all connected. Everything's connected.
I think that I'm sure we're going to talk about this later, but it also brings I think a greater legitimacy to many of the wisdom traditions around the world. I come from, an Eastern background. It was my study focus in school. I speak Mandarin Chinese fluently. I spent a good deal of time over in Asia. And there are many traditions on the eastern half of the world that do have always embraced this notion of connection, that there is a deeper subconscious understanding in the human existence that brings us all together, that pushes us in the same direction. And I love when science and philosophy or science and religion can line up.
There's another principle that operates, and it's called entropy. Entropy actually comes out of the second law of thermodynamics, but entropy basically says this: that every single time there is an exchange of energy, and you'll see I'm going to tie this back to information in a minute because it's called the entropy of information. Every single time there's an exchange of energy, there's a certain amount of energy that is then forever unavailable in the universe. If you apply that concept to information, and in my model, that is exactly how information works. Every single time there is an exchange of information, that in that particular kind of event is then forever unavailable for the future. In other words, it causes what you might think of as the arrow of time. In other words, I can't go back and automatically recreate another event identical. I can create something that is approximately identical, but I cannot create the identical event because the information for that event has already been used up. I want to come back to this business of entanglement because there's one more. You'll like this, Elle. This will fit completely into your model. Is that if you read this sentence in red, it says when two particles, such as a pair of photons or electrons, become entangled, they remain connected even when separated by vast distances. Now, I've taken that quote comes out of that's not my quote. That's somebody else's quote commenting on it. Here's the problem. The problem is that those photons and electrons don't exist until they're observed. Therefore, they don't exist at all. What exists is they exist as probabilities, and they share the same set of information. So it is the act of observation. I'll get into that in a minute that causes them to come into being. This is going to become real obscure, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Think of it like this. Those two particles are existing as a probability not in real fact. In other words, they're not separated by vast distances. They exist everywhere in the universe at that same moment in time until they're brought into reality.
Yeah, bringing them into reality is becoming observed. So becoming noticed, becoming seen or realized.
In quantum mechanics, it's called measured. Until they're
Mm.
measured, or in John Wheeler's model, until they're observed, they do not exist. They exist as a probability. So the whole notion that they are connected, even when separated by vast distances, is an error. They are not separated by vast distances because in reality, they don't exist. There is no such thing as vast distances. They're probably going to happen, or they probably exist. So the evolution then, what happens with the information field is that it is governed by principles, laws, and rules. Gravity, for example, in my model, is a principle. It's an example of a phenomenon that comes out of the rules and the laws and the principles that govern reality. So we want to know, okay, what are those principles? What are they? When we decode them, we decode them into differential equations, which is nothing more than a language. And Stephen Hawking said it, I thought, real well. Physics is just a mathematical structure. There must be something that underlies the structure, something that breathes fire into the equations. That's the idea, the notion of being purpose-driven. That was from Stephen Hawking himself.
I love that.
Okay.
Breathes fire. That's cool.
So all outcomes are governed by principles. Let me give you an example. You learn to fly in the face of the culture telling us that we couldn't, because what we did is we acted consistent with the principles that govern that outcome. It was learning how to act consistent with the principles that govern flying that empowered us to fly. So it's not that we can't do something, it is because we primarily don't recognize our relationship to the principles so we can act consistent with them. This is an important concept for me. This is actually the core of almost all my work. To the degree to which we act consistent with principles is the degree to which we're empowered. Now we're moving towards the question of how do we have free will? In other words, because if everything is being driven, purpose driven, and things are probably going to happen and we're entangled, it raises the question of are we being driven without will, or do we have will?
Well, we have free will within the principle. Like we can't defy gravity. Like I can't say I hate gravity, I'm not going to fall when I jump off this cliff. Like I'm sorry, I'm going to fall no matter what I want. I still have free will to make the choice, but I can't defy the principle. This is very gospel related. We're empowered when we stop trying to go against the principles and start going with them instead, going with that flow.
Acting consistent with principle is empowering.
Exactly.
Right.
All stress, all struggle, all conflict are the product of acting inconsistent with the principles that govern the outcome we intend.
There is a Buddhist notion or a Taoist notion. Buddhism has elements of this, but it really gets it's because Buddhism and Taoism overlap in a lot of senses. They've influenced each other. In Taoism, there is this principle called the Tao, and it is the way that everything works, which is it's a hilarious principle because much like who was it at the beginning of the quote that you quoted that said, if you don't understand, if it doesn't scare you, if it doesn't shock you, then you obviously don't understand it. The Tao is very much like this. It's this great knowable and yet unknowable. When you understand the Tao, you actually have no understanding of the Tao at all. But when you're in movement with the Tao, which is the greater encompassing workings of the universe and the world, when you're in alignment with that Tao, you are moved by life instead of trying to move against life and being unproductive because you aren't within that giant river that is the Tao pulling you forward through your purpose and through your universe. And I feel like this is reflective a lot of this. Just like Camille was saying, like when we discern, when we figure out how the world works, which science is doing, like you were talking about entropy, like gravity, like thermodynamics. These are ways that everything must function. And if we operate within those rules, if we figure out the pathway through those rules and we navigate those rules, greater information opens up to us, and we can then do miraculous things like learn to fly because we understand lift, we understand thrust, we understand gravity. Um, and I think within technology and the development of technology, we see that all the time as we begin to understand the greater principles of even quantum mechanics, and that brings us to like quantum computers and AI technology and all these kinds of things. But I do see a lot of spiritual overtones within like the workings of God. God works within specific principles which dictate outcomes in our lives in very similar ways. It's not that he wants to punish us. It's not that he wants negative outcomes for us. We're operating without the principles of the universe. We're operating with outside of these things which have already dictated the outcome that must be. And so we, like you said, we bring our own conflict, we bring our own strife into our life by operating outside of these principles that are, it's like, I have a really great friend who loves board games. Um, and she gave a really great analogy one time that she called game theory about how God regulates the universe. And I see this directly reflected in the things that you're talking about as related to human existence and religion. God, there is a game that we're all playing right now. We're playing the game of life. And there are rules about how life must function. And as we play that game, if we abide by the rules, we gain points, we gain experience, we gain money, we gain all these things within the game of life to move our piece forward on the board. But if we step outside of that and we start playing the game of dominoes or the game of treble or the game of checkers, we're no longer engaged in the game of life, and we stop progressing along the board. We stop gaining the chance cards or the money or whatever it is in the game we're playing because we're no longer existing within the rules of the board. And then we start to fail. We start to get natural consequences that are opposed to the game of life because we're not playing that game anymore. And so I love that as applied to here. Like there are rules that govern the universe that we have to abide by. Like Camille was saying with gravity.
Yeah.
If we step off a building, we are going to fall. And it's useless to push against those things in the wrong direction. It gives us nothing.
I would also add to this conversation that most central fundamental principle of everything is that real power comes from telling the truth. Telling the truth is not my truth or your truth. It is the truth. We'll move on to this because this is actually I think the next step in this process. We confuse thinking and believing with knowing.
Right.
At the core of what you guys are doing, you are leaning towards knowing. Believing something is to arrive at a conclusion about something and then to filter and screen the information so that you are constantly validating what it is you believe. Knowing does not require, which is your Taoist point, knowing does not require evidence. And part of the dilemma that people have is that they make a decision about something like intuition, and they'll say intuition is just fluff. It's just foo-foo. It's just somebody's, fantasy. It isn't real. And then when they have it, they don't recognize it. When you have it and you trust it and you know it, then it does the evidence against it is irrelevant. Part of the challenge that I like to bring from my work is move people from believing into knowing, because I hold the notion that everybody can know, but it requires work. To give you an example, when I'm demonstrating and proving this, I'll say, I like to ski. So I'll say, do you know how to ski? Do you believe you can ski? And if they can ski, they say, no, I know I can ski. But if they don't know they can ski, then they say, well, I don't think I can, or I don't think I'm good at it. And they put layers of stuff on it. But for example, there's not a lot we know, but we have the capacity to know everything that's important. That's my assertion. So that you can ski, you have to fall down less and less.
Success.
I'm laughing because I grew up learning how to ski, and now when I go, I don't fall very often. So I also don't like push myself down the moguls and do the hardest runs. But I know I can ski the blues really well.
Well, but that's just now talking about the degree to which you you can
Proficiency.
exercise your influence over the mountain.
Yeah.
But if you know, do you think you can ski, or do you know you can ski?
I know I can ski.
Yeah, notice that. Notice that. And if I said, well, no, you just think you can, it becomes irrelevant. You go, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Watch me ski. I'll show you.
Yeah, and this is going to become relevant for me because earlier I said something to you. I said, believe nothing and question everything. And what we're talking about is it's almost an oxymoron, because certain things that we're going to talk about, I can say I know, but certain things and I don't believe them. So I don't believe them, but I know that they're real. So it's a hard concept for people to accept often. So we believe something to be true, and then we interact in reality in such a way as to create our results the same as if we believe them to be true. In other words, when we believe something, we interact in such a way that we create the evidence that proves we're right.
Right. A
Now,
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, my grandmother, my actual real grandmother, was born before flying was possible. And she used to tell the story before they flew, people in church were saying, no. When we were supposed to be flying, we'd have wings. So I love this. This piece for me is really a treat. Lord Kelvin, who happened to be an incredibly brilliant scientist, the whole Kelvin temperature scale was created by Lord Kelvin. He said, I can state flatly that heavier than air machines are impossible. In 1903, New York Times predicted that airplanes would take 10 million years to develop. 9 weeks later, the Wright brothers achieved manned flight. I think that's also a great commentary on our media.
Yeah. 10 million years. Where did they pull that number from?
It was interpret your experts.
It was a science. Yeah, it was an expert. It was a scientist. What makes it a treat for me is that we sit here and we go, how stupid? How long is it going to be before we make similar kinds of statements about intuition and about precognition?
With the Wright brothers, I think the key here, what you were saying, is speak truth, acknowledge truth, or the fact that we don't know all of the truth. The Wright brothers discovered how to use lift, how to use thrust, how to use gravity, to work within these principles that existed, that dictate our life. They found out how to work within those principles to achieve something that seemed impossible
100%.
because I'm going to use the word belief here. They believed that they could. And I think that the trap within humanity comes from thinking that we know all of these principles that govern our reality, when I feel like we're just touching on them, like we're scratching the surface. We have some understanding about how some of these things work, and we're growing in that all the time. Like they grew within flight and thrust and gravity. But um, acknowledging the fact that we don't understand all the principles, but working within our understanding of the principles that we do know is what empowers us. We're acknowledging the big T truth that exists beyond where we think we exist. And once we can work within those, we actually open up a huge realm of possibility, like flight.
There are two things that I would clarify. Number one is I said power comes from telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Not from assuming the truth, not from accepting the truth, but from telling the truth. It's an active and a constructive process. So in order for the Wright brothers to actually fly, they had to go from beyond belief to suspecting they could do it.
Mm-hmm.
So they moved into, we think we can do it. We have a real strong suspicion that this is going to be possible. They put their lives on the line because they had this strong suspicion that it was possible. I'll give you a quick example. I work with people all the time in organizations and companies. And somebody will say, I couldn't come to work today because my car broke down. Okay, now that is their truth. And you hear people talking today about my truth versus your truth. Okay, their truth is that their car broke down. But the truth is they weren't willing to do what it took to get to work. So having the car break down became a reason that was acceptable to them so that they didn't have to go to work. They would rather fix the car, use the car, than have to pay the price. I'm not making a judgment about right or wrong. Is it good or bad? I'm not going there at all. I'm simply saying that's not the truth. The truth is they weren't willing, and I use this term frequently, to pay the price to get what they wanted, and achieve the outcome that they intended. The truth is they could. The truth is that they didn't do what it took. And so when we talk about power comes from telling the truth, when somebody goes through that and says, okay, I wasn't late, or I could have gone to work. Now the question is, was it important to me? And if it was important to me, what did I have to do in order to get it? If I want my children to grow and learn, and I say they can't because they're being taught other stuff outside of what I want them to learn, and I don't have control over them, that's not the truth. The truth is they're not willing to confront the obstacles to make certain that their children are empowered in a way that is consistent with their own values.
So you're saying that the truth is empowering because we realize the actual cost that we have to pay to do something. So
and we get there, and we take the power back.
Right.
And the minute that you say the reason is not the cause of what I'm doing, that I am the cause, this is going to become really important in a few minutes, but I am the cause of what is happening. Then you have the ability to say, okay, I'm not going to give the power to the car. I'm going to give, the power is me. I have the capacity to do it, and I'm going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this topic because my background is in life coaching, and I teach people that when we are willing to be creative and be solution oriented, then we can find solutions that otherwise we will be blocked from. Like an example is one time my husband wanted to go on this backpacking trip, and we only had one car at the time. Our other car had just gotten totaled. We decided not to buy a new car. We were just going to get by with one car. It was early in our marriage, and we thought we could make it work. And he was like, yeah, I want to go on this trip, but I just can't. I don't have a car. And I was like, okay, well, like, let's problem solve. Like, what can you do? And he's like, I don't know. And I was like, okay, so if you thought there were possibly a solution, where would you go? I was trying to like spark some creativity because he was just kind of down about it. And so I was trying to come up with some creative solutions. And we eventually figured it out. But like, you're not going to get to those, you're not going to be able to fly like the Wright brothers if you don't first have the desire, second, thinks that it's possible. You don't have to know how to get started. You just have to be engaged in like, what if I tried this? Like, you become more creative when you become more playful with the what ifs. You're not going to get anywhere if you're not willing to pay the price of failing a few times, failing forward.
Keep working with this conversation about the Wright brothers. So there are 2 points of view. There were people who believed you could fly and did nothing. There were people who believed you couldn't fly and did nothing. So it wasn't the belief that made the difference. What made the difference was that it was an active and a constructive process. They actively engaged in it. And they said, okay, let's look at if what we can do can make a difference. And I refer to that as paying the price. I put no judgment on people not paying the price. I go to the place of power comes from telling the truth. And it is a profound mechanism for getting our power because it requires that we act consistent with the principles that govern the outcome. Belief does not require that we act consistent with the principles.
Yeah, but truth does.
Acknowledging truth, accepting truth. I feel like acknowledging is the first step. You have to understand that it is truth, and then you have to act on that truth to create power, to bring that power back to you, to have change occur. So I just looked this up because it reminded me of the famous Johnny Depp quote from Pirates of the Caribbean. That part where they're on the ship and he has just Will Turner and Jack Sparrow, and he's like, the only rules that really matter are these: what a man can do and what a man can't do. You can accept that your father was a pirate and a good man, or you can't. The pirate is in your blood, boy, so you'll have to square with that someday. It's reality. It is the fact. And for me, for example, I can let you drown, but I can't bring this ship into Tortuga by my onesie savvy. So he's like, these are the realities, these are the facts. Either we can accept that and act upon those realities, or we can believe differently and function ineffectively within reality.
That's the
Okay.
basically the that's the basis of life coaching is if you're believing thoughts that are not true, you're going to get stuck. And if you can free yourself from that and get into that Tao river of truth, I mean, we don't really call it the
Right.
Tao river, but it's the same concept.
It's the
Then
same
you're going
principle,
to
just labeled
function at a
something
much
different.
higher level. You're going to function at a higher
Right.
level. You're going to be more creative. You're going to be a problem solver. You're going to be happier. Your relationships will be better. It's the
You're going to hit
foundation.
potential. You're going to
Truth.
reach a potential that's
Yeah.
otherwise unavailable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to labor this with you because I see it a little differently, but I'm going to suggest that the most fundamental act of acknowledging the truth is that you don't know.
Right. Yeah.
It's the act of not knowing the answers and then suspecting you can work through them that is empowering.
Hmm.
And that's faith. We can move on.
Okay. So Jessica Utz, she's the one that is the former president of the American Statistical Association. And she says it makes it very difficult for science to get a fair hearing because most people, frankly, are not interested in what the science has to say because they've already made up their mind. They already believe what it is that they're saying. Almost everybody has an opinion on whether or not this stuff is real, the stuff we're talking about. So here's what Jessica Utz has done. She is statistically verified, and I'll tell you at what level she's statistically verified. She statistically verified the existence of precognition. She says, my bottom line is if we were to treat this area like we treat other areas of science, we would be totally convinced that psychic abilities are real. There's so much evidence out there, the statistical evidence. So there really is a lot of strong statistical evidence. Now, let me tell you how in a conversation with her, how she framed it. She said, there is no vaccine or medicine of any kind that has been tested to the level of this conversation. I like this example. You'll hear frequently that aspirin will prevent a heart attack, but she calls that weak evidence. He says that they've not done the kind of research and the statistical analysis that would demonstrate that there's strong evidence. There is strong evidence about precognition and psychic abilities. So precognition is the fact that some people can predict targets before they're even chosen. She refers to that as something different. And this is their quote that I said earlier. I quoted, parapsychology gives us a clue about what we don't know about physics, time, and space, as well as human consciousness in the brain. So to my satisfaction, after having spent quite a bit of time with her, I'm 100% confident that it's something that has been demonstrated, has been tested, and clearly is something we can talk intelligently about in the field of science.
So why do you think, Doug, that these things don't catch on in a more mainstream accepted way within the world of physics?
I think, first of all, it's easy to label this stuff as fringe. And the minute you label it as fringe, you intimidate core scientists. So you have scientists whose work is dependent on grants,
Right.
and most of the time, the money is to do work in areas that are acceptable, that the community considers credible. And so what we've done is we've compromised to a large degree a lot of the work in science. So Jessica took a great risk in doing it. She was hired by the Department of Defense. She did a study on precognition and what was called remote viewing. And she established clearly for the government, using defense money, that it was valid and real. And the Defense Department created a group that do and are active in remote viewing.
Do you think that, this is my personal opinion on many of these intuitive based things, that it's just like education of the populace that might be behind because we don't have, I mean, with more education on things like her work that has been statistically proven again and again and again, replicated results again and again and again. If we change the general notion of population on this, that it would um, be more accessible to people. I use the example frequently in medical science of like chiropractic used to be very fringe, very, very fringe medicine. And it was something that it wasn't generally acceptable to go see a chiropractor. And yet today we have chiropractic in the hospital. My husband, who's in the military, gets referred to a chiropractor every single week, which something 10 years ago might have seemed outlandish.
Yeah.
So I think education may be key in helping people understand that this is in the realm of intuition. It's something that operates by those principles that you were talking about, that fundamentally guide our reality, and maybe could open up people's I don't want to use the word belief. We've already established that's a no-no word. But open up their awareness of the possibility, and thus push this further into a less fringy realm.
There's a great quote I like, which is, new science only comes about when old men die.
That's rough.
Shockingly accurate. The Wright brothers,
Yeah,
again, for instance, they were really young. They were really young men to discover something so new, whereas the New York Times and Lord Kelvin, who were older, who were established maybe in the field of science, had no credibility for the fact that flight could exist.
and
It,
Einstein disagreed extensively with Niels Bohr on this business of entanglement, and he referred to it as God doesn't play dice in the universe. But the problem has been, now here we are almost 100 years later, is that quantum mechanics has become the single most tested science in
Right.
history, and Einstein couldn't accept it. Even
Yeah.
towards the end of his life, he was arguing it. Eugene Wigner won a Nobel Prize, his Nobel Prize laureate. He said it was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum theory in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. Now, this is the next step in our conversation, which is the journey towards what is our role? What role do we play? Do we have free will? So, what is consciousness? So, we have to talk about that. My view, this is going to be my view, is shared by many, but it's also not entirely mainstream. My view of what consciousness it comes from relationship. In other words, everything has to be in relationship. Because go back to my conversations about the beginning, way back to the very beginning, that diagram where we talked about it, the thumb drive. In order to cause an event, a relationship had to happen. So consciousness comes out of the creation of events and things being in relationship. Philip Goff says consciousness goes down to the fundamental building blocks of matter. Fundamental particles or fields have incredibly rudimentary forms of consciousness, and the complex consciousness of the human and animal brain is somehow built up from these more basic forms of consciousness. John Wheeler used an analogy that I like. He said that if you had a rock and you put a leaf on top of the rock, the sun baked an image onto the rock of the leaf over several thousand years, that rock recorded those events, and those events were aspects of what I would characterize as consciousness, or what in quantum mechanics is referred to as measurement. That most fundamental act of creation is observation and participation. So consciousness is the awareness of the recognition of a relationship. And every aspect of our universe is in relationship. And that action causes the event, and the event becomes information. So John Wheeler said the most fundamental, and I quote him on this all the time, the most fundamental act of creation is observation and or participation. In other words, what we observe, we cause. With what we participate, we create. And in John Wheeler's model, the rock and the leaf created a measurement that recorded information, and that information then becomes part of the information field.
When you say what we observe, we cause, um, that goes back to what you said prior with information does not exist unless it is measured, unless it is observed. I want to unpack that just a little bit further, I think, for general understanding of our viewership. Can you explain more about what that means? What does it mean that it doesn't exist until it's observed? Because I think we look at something and we're like, well, that should exist whether or not someone is there to witness it. What does quantum physics have to say that proves that
Okay,
inaccurate?
so let's go here. The future, what the future exists in what are called states of probabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Probably going to happen. Do you remember we go back earlier to our conversation about the particles and entanglement? Mm-hmm. Okay, remember I said that they don't really separate over great distances. They don't exist until they're measured.
Yeah.
So what existed then? What existed was information about the past and the probability of that occurring in the future. So it is the act of observation, measuring, that causes those particles to come into being so they can be measured. Because what happens in entanglement is you change the direction of one particle, spread over a great deal of distance, and it changes the direction of the other particle. So in other words, if they're entangled, call this direction spin, you have upspin and downspin. So if you change the spin of one particle so that it now is down, the other one will change so it is up. And it is the act of observation and measurement that causes that to come into being. Until then, it doesn't exist.
How do we know it doesn't exist?
I think the deeper question is how do we know it does exist? And the way we know it exists is because it comes into being.
Because we observe it.
Because we see it, yes.
Yeah, because we observe it. And that's the whole thesis of quantum mechanics, is that it is the act of measuring something that literally changes the way the information is recorded. In quantum mechanics, they've actually tested this. Do two people observing the same event have the same experience?
No,
probably not.
And the answer is no. They've demonstrated there is no such thing as an objective reality.
Right.
I'm the first to acknowledge that it's confusing, and I'm the first to acknowledge that it's extremely difficult to accept. So let's define what intention is. Intention is defined as the direction or orientation of the mind towards an object. So the future exists in states of probabilities. Some things are probably going to happen, and some things probably will not happen. And it is your conscious intention that highly determines which happens.
So your intention, if we go back to the Wright brothers example, they had the intention to figure out flying, whereas whoever wrote that in the New York Times said it won't happen for 10 million years. So they had no intention of putting time or effort into figuring it out. So intention is proven by action and, accepting that you're not going to get it right a lot of times until you're intending to figure it out. You're not going to give up.
Or intention creates action.
Yeah, and you're going to put in that work.
I did some work with Benjamin Libet and Bertram Feinstein. They were at Mount Sinai Hospital in San Francisco. They were breakthrough neurophysiologists. Their work's been published. It's been tested and tested and tested. What they found was that there is a lag between conscious awareness and our action, a delay that occurs between when we start to act to do something and when we become aware and conscious of it. And that it's roughly 2 full seconds. The title of the paper, when I read about it, was "Is Free Will a Fraud?" Because it indicated that the brain was already in the process of intending something to happen and setting it up to occur up to a half a second before we did it. So the conclusion was there is no free will. The brain is automatically doing all of this stuff. We're on automation, and we then become aware of it after we've already done it. But that denies the fact that who we are, I refer to it as a bicameral mind. We have a bicameral brain that has who I am separate from who I think I am. And who I am gets smothered and covered over by this unconscious mind and the history that we bring, and we have lots of history. And so to some degree, who I am becomes covered up. But psychic abilities, precognition, and intuition all operate in that arena of what we would call unconscious or subconscious. So part of the process of taking charge of our outcomes is to become more in tune or aware of how we manage our intention. I like to think of it as stilling the brain, quiet it down. Because when we quiet it down, we then have access.